The wreck. The wreck had been resting in the valley for weeks and still no one dared to touch it. The alien battleship was once the pride of a mighty empire, but now it was a broken hulk with shattered plating and collapsed engines. Entire teams of engineers had arrived from across the galaxy. Each one had come with scanners, drones, and diagnostic machines. They walked around the twisted hull shaking their heads and speaking in grim tones. They declared the ship unrepairable. They said the core was fried, the circuits had melted, and the frame had been twisted in ways that no known tool could fix. The words impossible and hopeless filled the air like smoke. Among those who stood in the valley that day were the alien commanders of several fleets. Their robes and armor gleamed as they discussed the wreck with folded arms and sharp eyes. They did not come for rescue or repair. They came for proof that nothing could be done. The ship was to be abandoned, a dead monument to a war that had ended badly for the empire that owned it. Yet whispers began to move through the valley. A group of humans was on their way. They were not soldiers, not diplomats, but cadets, young men and women barely out of their teens. They came from Earth, a Deathworld that most species whispered about in fear and respect. The announcement was met with laughter. The aliens could not believe it. What would humans do with this corpse of a ship that entire fleets of engineers had already failed to revive? To them, this was another chance to laugh at the strange, stubborn species that seemed to enjoy danger more than safety. When the humans arrived, they did not arrive in grand ships or with heavy machines. They came walking with simple packs on their backs, wearing uniforms of a dark gray that looked plain compared to the gleaming robes of alien engineers. Their boots sank slightly in the dusty soil as they stopped before the wreck. They looked at the great blackened hull with steady eyes. Some of the cadets exchanged grins. Others simply nodded as if they had been waiting for this moment. One of them, a tall cadet named Rourke, ran his hand across the burned plating and said softly, "Well, it is not that bad." The aliens around them burst into laughter. The laughter was not cruel at first. It was mocking, like older children laughing at the foolish dreams of the young. They pointed at the broken engines. They pointed at the ruptured reactor. They reminded the cadets that entire guilds of engineers had declared this ship beyond salvation. But the cadets did not flinch. They spread out, moving around the hull, touching the torn cables and twisted beams. They spoke to one another in calm voices, asking questions and making quick notes, with nothing more than old-style tablets. What made the crowd pause was the way the humans looked at the wreck. They did not see a grave. They saw a puzzle. The cracked reactor was not a final death to them, but a challenge. The melted conduits were not useless. They were pieces waiting to be bent, cut, and reused. The humans did not ask what tools they lacked. They asked what could be built with what was left. The alien commanders grew impatient. They called the human effort childish. They told them the day would end with nothing achieved. They warned that meddling with such a wreck could be dangerous, but the cadets only smiled. They had come from Deathworld academies where every day was danger. They were trained not just in theory, but in survival. They learned to fix things when nothing worked. They learned to build when there were no supplies. They learned to breathe under pressure that would crush others. By the time the sun rose higher above the valley, the cadets were already at work. One of them crawled deep inside a torn corridor, dragging a coil of makeshift wire. Another used a hammer that looked far too small for the job, yet every strike bent metal back into place. A third cadet rewired a console with fingers moving, as quickly as a musician playing notes. The crowd of aliens that had gathered to laugh at them slowly began to watch in silence. It was not the progress that stunned them, but the attitude. The humans did not despair. They joked with each other as sparks flew. They worked with bare hands and simple tools. They smiled through the dust and heat. They looked like creatures enjoying a game, rather than fighting against the impossible. The aliens who had declared the wreck unrepairable began to feel something they had not felt in years. A flicker of doubt. And so the legend began with a broken ship that the galaxy had abandoned, and a group of cadets who looked at it and saw a puzzle worth solving. The first hours had only just begun, but already the silence of the alien crowd carried a weight heavier than any verdict. Because for the first time since the ship had fallen, there was a hint of possibility, and the ones carrying that possibility were humans. The skeptics, as the human cadets, worked around the wreck. The alien officers leaned on their staffs and laughed louder. Some of them whispered bets about how long the humans would last before giving up. Others argued whether the cadets would get themselves injured before they realized the futility of the task. The skepticism was thick and heavy across the valley like a storm waiting to break. The aliens were not only convinced that the humans would fail, they wanted them to fail because the wreck had already embarrassed so many empires, and no one wanted to see their judgment overturned by a group of young Deathworlders. The cadets ignored the jeers, as if they were nothing more than background noise. They spoke quietly among themselves, measuring broken beams and examining cracked conduits. Their leader, a young woman named Captain Elira, despite only being a cadet, had a voice that carried authority. She moved from group to group, giving instructions and sketching diagrams on her pad. Her calm focus unsettled the crowd of onlookers because she did not act like a desperate child grasping at straws. She acted like someone who already had a plan. One of the alien engineers stepped forward, a tall figure from the Sarathi species with scales like polished bronze. He raised his voice and called out to the cadets, telling them that they were wasting their time. He explained that the main reactor was burned beyond recovery and that the central frame was cracked in 3 places. He reminded them that the most advanced repair drones had already tried and failed. The cadets listened politely, and then one of them, Rourke, tilted his head and asked a single question. Did your drones try bypassing the fracture instead of sealing it? The Sarathi blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the idea. He muttered that such a method would be reckless and inefficient and stormed back to the other engineers, while the humans exchanged knowing smiles. The aliens continued to mock them by offering food and drinks as if expecting the cadets to walk away hungry and tired before noon. Yet the cadets stayed focused. Every time one of them found a collapsed circuit or a jammed hydraulic pump, they called over another cadet who seemed to know exactly what to do. They treated the wreck like an enormous puzzle, each broken piece sparking laughter and interest instead of despair. At one point, 2 cadets tore open a section of burnt wall with their bare hands, revealing a hidden secondary conduit that none of the alien scanners had detected. The alien crowd fell silent for a moment, realizing that perhaps the humans were seeing things differently. As the hours passed, the skepticism began to shift. Some aliens whispered that maybe the humans had a strange talent for improvisation. Others shook their heads and said it was only coincidence. They told themselves that even if the cadets fixed a few wires or lit up a console, the ship would never fly again. Still, they could not look away. The sight of humans working, together with such fierce joy, pulled at their curiosity. Captain Elira stood before the shattered reactor casing and traced the cracks with her fingers. Her face was smeared with dust and grease, but her eyes glowed with determination. She turned to her cadets and gave a speech not loud, but strong enough to reach the ears of the alien crowd. She reminded them that on Earth nothing ever worked the way it should, and yet they learned to fix it anyway. She told them that survival on a death world meant making fire with wet wood and building shelter with broken stones. She said that if the galaxy called this ship impossible, then it was their duty to prove the galaxy wrong. The words carried more weight than the aliens expected. For many of them, survival was about technology and resources. For the humans, survival was about stubbornness and invention. That truth made some of the commanders shift uncomfortably in their seats because they began to understand why humans had a reputation that stretched across the stars. By the time the second hour passed, the cadets had begun to organize their work in a rhythm. Some rewired panels, while others scavenged pieces from the wreck to craft makeshift tools. One cadet even pulled off his belt and used it as a strap to hold a bent conduit in place. The improvisation horrified the alien engineers, who muttered that it was madness, but deep inside some part of them wanted to see what would happen next. The skepticism had not vanished, but it had changed shape. It was no longer the sneering of certain failure. It was the nervous laughter of people who felt their certainty begin to slip. The cadets had not yet achieved a victory, but already they had planted a seed of doubt in the hearts of those who came to mock them, and as the aliens exchanged glances with one another, they could not help but wonder what would happen if these Deathworlders actually succeeded. The challenge begins. The valley was hot with the rising sun, and dust clung to the sweat on the faces of the cadets as they bent over the shattered ship. The air buzzed with the voices of the alien crowd who were still waiting for the moment when the humans would stumble and admit defeat. Instead of faltering, the cadets moved faster and with more energy. Their strange rhythm of work looked chaotic to outsiders, but to them it was like breathing. One cadet pulled apart a burned power junction, while another stripped insulation from half-melted wires with nothing more than the blade of a pocket knife. A third crawled deep under a collapsed corridor and shouted measurements back to his teammates, who recorded them without hesitation. The aliens shook their heads and whispered about how reckless the humans were for them. Repair was a slow process of careful steps, measured calculations, and long reports. To see humans dive into the wreck with nothing but grit and laughter was unthinkable. Yet there was something unsettling about the way progress kept appearing where none should have been. A dead console sparked weakly under the touch of a cadet who had rewired it with parts scavenged from a ruined turret. Nearby, another cadet pried open an engine casing and hammered it straight using nothing more than a piece of pipe and a rock. The crowd laughed, but their laughter carried unease. Captain Alira stood on a beam overlooking the central reactor chamber. Her face was streaked with grease and her eyes sharp with focus. She issued orders with the confidence of someone who had led her team through storms and fire. Her cadets responded instantly, crawling, climbing, and lifting with trust in her voice. She did not act like a student. She acted like a commander in battle, and that frightened some of the alien officers who watched from the sidelines. They had seen hardened veterans hesitate before wrecks like this, yet these Deathworld cadets acted as though the challenge was nothing more than another lesson at their academy. One alien commander from the Kalar species finally spoke loudly enough to silence the crowd. He declared that the humans were not brave but foolish. He said they did not respect danger and would only break the ship further with their crude methods. His voice carried weight, and the other aliens nodded in agreement. But just as his words echoed across the valley, one of the cadets shouted from inside the hull. A light had flickered on within a long, dead corridor. The murmur of the crowd turned into gasps. The commander's face tightened, but he said nothing. The cadets laughed among themselves and slapped each other on the shoulders. The flicker of light was small, but it was proof that progress was real. They moved with renewed energy, tearing away more debris and piecing together new paths of power. Elira ordered them to link the secondary conduits with the bypass. Rourke and two others set to work, dragging coils of wire through the wreck. Their movements were clumsy but determined, and within minutes the dull hum of current began to flow faintly through the wreck. The alien engineers could not look away. They leaned forward, eyes wide, as they watched human improvisation unfold before them. What made no sense to them made perfect sense to the cadets who had grown up on a world where survival often meant making tools from scraps and solutions from desperation. The humans treated the wreck as if it were alive and only sleeping. The more they touched it, the more it seemed to stir hours. Past and sweat turned their uniforms dark, but the cadets did not slow. They cracked jokes, sang fragments of songs, and encouraged each other as sparks flew across their work. The crowd that had once mocked them now stood in tense silence, waiting for what would come next. The cadets were not only repairing a ship, they were tearing down the certainty that had surrounded it. The galaxy had declared the vessel dead, but humans were teaching it to breathe again. By midday, the sound of hammering and the smell of burning insulation filled the air. Several panels inside the wreck glowed faintly with restored power. The cadets cheered and clapped their hands as though they had already won a victory. The aliens stared in disbelief, torn between admiration and fear. They had mocked the Deathworlders when the work began, but now they were forced to face the truth. The humans had turned the challenge into a game, and they were winning it with nothing more than stubborn willpower and relentless spirit. And as the sun reached its highest point, the crowd understood that this was no longer a question of if the cadets would succeed, but when the turning point. The valley had grown quiet by the time the cadets reached the heart of the wreck. What had begun as laughter and jeers had shifted into silence, broken only by the clang of tools and the buzz of sparks. Aliens from dozens of species crowded the edges of the site, with their eyes fixed on the humans. The cadets had worked without pause, Since morning, their hands dark with grease, their uniforms torn and stained, yet their energy never faded. They were moving like a single machine guided by Captain Elira's sharp commands, and the instinct that had been forged on a Deathworld where hesitation meant death. Deep inside the reactor chamber, Rourke and two others were bent over the cracked housing of the core. The chamber smelled of burnt metal and ozone, the air heavy with dust. The aliens had warned again and again that the core was a lost cause. They said the fractures ran too deep and that no force in the galaxy could contain its unstable energy. But the cadets saw something else. They saw weak points that could be bypassed. They saw fractures that could be braced. They saw energy not as a threat but as a resource waiting to be redirected. Elira's voice cut through the air, telling them to reroute power through the auxiliary feeds. The cadets obeyed, twisting cables and forcing them into new channels. The makeshift wiring was messy, and alien engineers watching from above covered their faces in horror. Yet when the last connection snapped into place, a low hum vibrated through the deck plates. The reactor that had been silent for weeks gave the faintest sign of life. The hum grew stronger, and a faint blue glow spread along the conduits. The valley erupted with gasps. The impossible had shifted into reality. The flickering lights inside the ship sent shockwaves through the crowd. Aliens who had spent their lives studying engineering whispered to each other in disbelief. Some argued that it was a trick. Others muttered that the humans had only awakened a fragment and that it would not last. But their voices were drowned out by the sound of the ship, itself groaning as power trickled into long-dead systems. Panels lit up one by one, screens that had been dark for weeks blinked alive with static and weak signals. The cadets roared with triumph, their voices echoing off the wreckage like a war chant. The alien commanders felt the ground shift beneath their certainty. One of them, a decorated officer of the Zakari fleet, demanded that the humans step back. He shouted that what they were doing was dangerous, and that the reactor could explode. At any moment his words carried authority, but they were ignored. The cadets had no fear of danger. They had grown up in forests filled with predators, in storms that could tear apart homes, in earthquakes and fires that left no mercy. A humming reactor was nothing compared to that. Elira turned to the commanders, her face streaked with sweat and dirt, and told them calmly that the work would not stop. She explained that on Earth survival came from pushing forward when others froze. She said that the ship was not dead but waiting to be reminded how to live. The strength in her voice left the alien commanders without a reply, because deep down they recognized that she spoke with the kind of certainty that could not be faked. By mid-afternoon, the turning point had become undeniable. The ship was alive again, though faintly. The consoles inside the control deck glowed. The reactor hummed with restrained energy, and the lights flickered across corridors that had been dark for weeks. The cadets stood among the sparks and shadows, smiling as if they had just begun a game rather than completed a miracle. The alien crowd stood frozen, torn between fear that the humans had awakened something dangerous and awe that they had achieved what no master engineer in the galaxy could. The laughter that had filled the valley in the morning was gone, replaced by whispers of respect and disbelief. The cadets had crossed the line between foolishness and legend. They had shown that what was declared impossible was only another challenge to them. The wreck was no longer a tomb but a living beast slowly stirring under human hands, and though the ship had only just begun to awaken, every alien present felt the same cold realization. If the humans could do this with nothing but scraps and stubborn will, then there was little in the galaxy that they could not do. Resistance from the Council. The news of the awakening ship spread across the valley faster than the sparks that leapt from the cadets' tools. By now, dozens more alien commanders had gathered, drawn by reports that the Deathworld cadets had done what no certified engineer had managed. They stood in tight groups, whispering with sharp voices, their eyes fixed on the glowing panels and the humming conduits of the once silent wreck. Some of them wore fear across their faces, while others carried the look of insult, because if humans succeeded, then the authority of the Council and its long traditions would be shaken. Captain Elira and her cadets did not stop for the gathering audience. Their work carried on with the same energy as before. Wires twisted and bent, beams hammered into alignment consoles flickering with faint light. The more the ship responded, the more agitated the commanders became. Finally, one stepped forward, a tall figure from the Vithari species whose voice carried, like thunder. He raised his hand and demanded that the cadets halt. He declared that the vessel was under the protection of the Galactic Council and that humans had no right to tamper with it. The cadets looked at each other, then at Elira, who stood on a broken support beam above the crowd. Her voice was calm yet carried across the valley. She reminded the commander that the Council had declared the ship lost beyond repair. She reminded them that the empires had turned their backs on it and that it was now nothing but abandoned scrap. She told them that if the Council wished to claim ownership, then they should have cared for it before they pronounced it dead. The words struck the air like stones and murmurs rippled through the onlookers. The Vithari commander bristled with anger, but he was not alone. Another officer stepped forward, this one from the Sarathi, whose engineers had been among the first to declare the ship unrepairable. He accused the cadets of recklessness and sabotage. He warned that if the reactor destabilized, the entire valley could be destroyed. The alien crowd shifted nervously at the thought, but the cadets did not falter. Rourke shouted back that survival on Earth meant living beside volcanoes and storms that could tear mountains apart. He said that if danger was enough to stop action, then nothing would ever be built. The clash of voices grew sharper as more commanders joined. Some argued that the humans were dangerous and unpredictable. Others whispered that perhaps the cadets had a right to continue since they had already proven progress. The council representatives knew that if the humans restored the ship, it would be remembered as a failure of alien authority. They could not allow that stain to remain on their pride. Yet the evidence of glowing lights and humming conduits was undeniable. Elira raised her hand and silence fell among her cadets. She spoke clearly that they would not abandon the challenge because to them, giving up was worse than death. She told the aliens that the council might see ruins, but humans saw puzzles. She said that every scar and every crack was simply another step in the test of survival. Her words were not shouted yet. They carried the force of unbreakable will. The crowd listened, and for many, the tone in her voice was stronger than the authority of the council. The commanders tried once more to force them to stop threatening sanctions and punishment. But the cadets laughed at the thought. Their academy on Earth had trained them under pressure that no council could imagine. To them, threats were just another storm to endure. As they returned to their work, the resistance of the council seemed smaller compared to the growing hum of the ship that trembled as power flowed deeper into its heart. By the end of the hour, the tension had reached its peak. The council representatives stood red-faced and frustrated, the crowd of aliens divided between fear of disaster and awe at the miracle unfolding. The cadets, however, kept working with steady hands and unshaken focus. For them, the council's resistance was nothing compared to the challenge before them. The ship was alive and growing stronger each minute, and no order or threat could pull them away from the task. They had already passed the point of no return, and everyone in the valley felt it. The humans would either restore the impossible or burn with it, but they would never turn back. The ship awakens. The sun stood high in the sky when the cadets drove the last length of wire into place and sealed the improvised bypass around the fractured core. The wreck that had once been silent now thrummed with a steady pulse like the heartbeat of a slumbering beast. The alien crowd pressed closer, unable to stop themselves from staring at the glow of panels and the hum of power that grew louder with every passing minute. Some covered their mouths in disbelief, while others shook their heads as if refusing to accept what they were seeing. For weeks the ship had been nothing more than a corpse, and now before their eyes it was beginning to live again. Inside the ruined corridors, the cadets moved quickly, their hands blackened by grease and their eyes alight with determination. They shouted to each other across the decks, calling out as lights flickered on above them and long silent systems came awake. One cadet laughed when a guidance console blinked to life, spitting static across the screen. Another cheered as hydraulic doors that had been fused shut creaked open under the pressure of restored power. The ship groaned and shuddered, but the cadets did not stop. They pressed forward as though the impossible had become a game they refused to lose. The alien commanders, who had spent the morning ridiculing the humans, now stood pale with unease. Their voices had grown quieter as the evidence piled higher. One of them whispered that the cadets had gone too far and that the reactor would surely collapse. Another muttered that this was witchcraft, not engineering. A third fell silent altogether, unable to tear his gaze away from the blue glow that spread through the veins of the ship like blood returning to frozen limbs. The council representatives who had ordered the cadets to stop now looked powerless in the face of reality. Captain Elira stood at the edge of the control deck, her arms folded across her chest and her eyes steady as she watched her team. The control deck itself had been shattered by fire and impact, but under the hands of the cadets it looked less like a ruin and more like a skeleton, knitting itself back together. Sparks fell from exposed wires. Smoke drifted from overheated conduits, yet the glow of power was undeniable. She called out instructions guiding her cadets to stabilize the auxiliary feeds to balance the reactor's pulse to seal off unstable channels. Her calm voice was the anchor that kept her team steady. Even as the ship trembled, the crowd gasped when the first external lights on the hull flickered alive. A soft glow ran across the blackened plating like eyes opening after a long sleep. The sound of energy thrummed across the valley, and the ground seemed to vibrate with the pulse of the reactor. For the aliens, it was a sound of terror because it shattered every truth they had accepted. For the humans, it was the sound of victory, the reward for grit and stubborn willpower. The cadets grinned through sweat and exhaustion, their laughter echoing from the broken corridors. One cadet shouted triumphantly as the communication system sparked to life, filling the control deck with distorted static. The aliens recoiled in shock, but the cadets leaned in eagerly, adjusting wires and rerouting connections until a faint voice crackled through the speakers. It was only a ghost of the ship's old systems, a half-broken log repeating fragments of data, but it was enough to make the alien engineers clutch their heads in disbelief. The ship was speaking again, and it was the Deathworld cadets who had coaxed it into doing so. The council representatives tried one last time to claim authority. They raised their voices, demanding that the cadets power the ship down before disaster struck, but their words sounded weak against the roar of energy that filled the air. The cadets ignored them. They had been told their whole lives that Deathworlders could not survive in the wider galaxy, that they were too reckless, too violent, too unstable. Yet here they stood, proving to every watching eye that humans did not bow to impossibility. They embraced it and turned it into triumph. By the time the sun began to dip, the ship was no longer a corpse. It was a wounded beast, breathing again, against the odds. Consoles glowed with steady light, the reactor thrummed with renewed strength, and the external lights shone like beacons across the valley. The cadets stood together, their faces smeared with sweat and dust, their hands raw from labor but their eyes bright with pride. The aliens who had mocked them now stared in awe and fear because they understood the truth. The humans had achieved the unthinkable, and they had done it before lunch. The wreck that had been abandoned by empires had become a monument, not to failure but to resilience, and every alien who witnessed the awakening knew that they would carry the story with them for the rest of their lives. Humans had shown them that where others saw the end, they saw a beginning. Where others surrendered, they fought, and where others said impossible, they simply smiled and got to work. Respect earned. The glow of the awakened ship spread across the valley as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. The cadets stood among the wreckage, covered in sweat, ash, and grease, but their faces were bright with pride. Around them, the alien crowd had grown silent. The jeers that once filled the air had vanished, replaced by a hush that carried both fear and reverence. Every eye was locked on the ship that had been declared beyond saving, now alive and humming under the hands of Deathworld cadets. Captain Elira stepped down from the control deck and faced the gathered commanders. Her posture was straight, her uniform tattered, but her presence stronger than any polished armor. She told them plainly that the ship had been abandoned and mocked as a failure, and yet her cadets had proved the galaxy wrong. She reminded them that survival on Earth demanded creativity and courage, and that this was not a miracle but a lesson. A lesson that humans thrived where others surrendered, and that nothing truly broken stayed broken if they had a chance to touch it. The alien commanders exchanged uneasy glances. Some wanted to protest, but the evidence loomed behind the cadets. A dead vessel reborn with nothing but stubbornness and scraps. The Sarathi engineer who had mocked them earlier could not even meet Illyra's eyes. The Vithari officer who had demanded they stop clenched his jaw but said nothing because he knew any word of denial would sound hollow. The council representatives who had threatened sanctions now looked powerless. Their authority shrunk before the living proof of human resolve. One of the younger alien engineers stepped forward with trembling hands and bowed his head toward the cadets. His voice shook as he admitted that he had thought them foolish, but now he saw that they carried a strength that no school of engineering could teach. The gesture rippled through the crowd. Slowly others lowered their heads, not in submission but in respect. It was reluctant for many but undeniable for all. The cadets had forced the galaxy to see them not as reckless children, but as builders and survivors. The cadets themselves did not cheer loudly as they might have. Instead, they stood together with quiet smiles and tired eyes. For them, this was not about glory. It was about proving to themselves and to the stars that their lessons on Earth had meaning, that the endless days of struggle on their homeworld had shaped them into something unyielding. They knew that the ship could fall apart again tomorrow. But what mattered was that they had brought it to life today. Rourke leaned against a beam and whispered to one of his teammates that the real fun had been watching the aliens gape with open mouths. Another cadet laughed softly, but their laughter was not cruel. It was the laughter of people who had wrestled with the impossible and won. The mood among them was light, but beneath it ran a deep current of pride. They had carried the reputation of humanity on their shoulders, and they had not faltered. As the last of the lights stabilized across the hull, the council finally spoke again. Their words were measured and heavy. They declared that the humans had done what none else could, and that the council would record this day in the annals of history. They admitted that humanity had shown a resilience that defied precedent. Though their voices were stiff, the meaning was clear. The council had been forced to acknowledge the strength they once dismissed. When the cadets finally stepped away from the ship, they carried themselves not as children who had impressed their elders, but as warriors who had stood against doubt and emerged victorious. The alien crowd parted to let them pass, no longer laughing, no longer mocking, but watching in silence. Some bowed slightly, some whispered words of respect, and others simply stared with the haunted look of those who had witnessed something that shattered the walls of their understanding. That evening, as the sun slipped below the horizon and the valley darkened, the tale of what had happened began to spread across comms and channels throughout the galaxy. It would travel faster than any ship, faster than any fleet, and it would change how humans were spoken of in distant halls. No longer only Deathworlders, no longer just reckless explorers. They were now the species that repaired the impossible by lunch and turned failure into legend. The cadets gathered around their captain and sat on the dusty ground, sharing water and food as if they had just finished an ordinary training exercise. Illyra looked at her team and told them that the galaxy had seen what they were capable of. She said that this was only the beginning, that more challenges would come, and that each one would be another chance to prove humanity's place among the stars. The cadets nodded their agreement, their eyes filled with quiet fire. And so the wreck that had been written off as a tomb became the stage of a new story, one that would echo across empires and councils for generations to come. The aliens had seen with their own eyes that when the word impossible was spoken, it was humans who smiled and stepped forward. The ship pulsed with borrowed life, the cadets with unbreakable spirit, and the galaxy with newfound respect for the stubborn, relentless children of Earth. The legend night fell over the valley, and the once silent wreck now glowed faintly beneath the stars. The ship no longer looked like a corpse, but like a wounded beast breathing slowly under the care of its unlikely healers. The cadets sat in a circle around Captain Illyra, their faces lit by the faint blue glow of the reactor that pulsed steadily behind them. They were exhausted, yet their eyes shone with the pride of a victory that no one could ever take from them. Around them, the alien crowd remained, but the sound of mockery had vanished, replaced by the murmur of voices telling each other that they had witnessed history. Commanders who had earlier shouted for the cadets to stop now stood in uneasy silence, realizing that the Authority of the Council had cracked before human persistence engineers, who had declared the ship lost, now whispered that perhaps there was something in humanity's blood that the rest of the galaxy would never understand. The cadets did not rise to boast. They did not walk proudly among the aliens demanding recognition. They ate quietly. They laughed with each other in the simple way of comrades who had survived another impossible trial. For them, the day had been less about glory and more about proving that their training on Earth meant something, that when they were faced with ruin and despair, they could create hope and light from nothing more than broken metal and willpower. Elira lifted her head and looked across the valley at the ship, her voice low but steady. She told her cadets that what they had done was more than repair. She said they had reminded the galaxy that survival was not about wealth or technology or power, but about refusing to give up when the world demanded surrender. She said that their people had always carried that truth in their bones, and now the stars had seen it too. The words carried into the night, and the aliens who heard them could not deny their weight. The wreck had become more than a machine. It was now a monument to stubborn human spirit. A monument that whispered to every commander and every engineer present that humanity was not to be measured by numbers or tools, but by something deeper, something unbreakable. As the stars stretched across the sky and the valley settled into silence, the cadets leaned back and closed their eyes. They had given life to the impossible, and in doing so, they had written a story that would echo across councils and fleets for generations. The galaxy would remember the day when Deathworld cadets turned ruin into power and silence into song. And so the ship rested, breathing again under the hands of those who refused to bow. And the galaxy learned a lesson it would never forget, that when others surrendered, humans endured, and when others said impossible, humans smiled and worked until the impossible became reality. The end.